Hi there, and welcome to Next Frontier. My name is Thomas Anderson, founder and CEO of Responsibly, and Next Frontier is my show about sustainability in the supply chain. Today, I'm talking to Melanie Rideout. While a lot of people I talk to have stumbled into sustainability, Melanie has been focused on sustainability and social issues since she was just 9 years old. And you know what got her there? Michael Jackson, of all people. That means Melanie has some really interesting perspectives on social and climate justice. From her time in the humanitarian sector working with the Red Cross, to being an investigative journalist on the ground in Brazil. We discuss what actually happens on the ground in the countries with some of the highest social and deforestation risks, and what you can do about it. Now, Melanie and I don't agree on everything. I'm probably more of a technology optimist, whereas Melanie is a hardcore realist, having been on the ground with a lot of these issues. But that makes for a really interesting dialogue and had me challenge some of my own beliefs as well. Okay, Melanie Rideout, humanitarian, climate advisor, and now film producer as well. Here we go. Hello, Melanie.
Hi, Thomas. Thanks for having me.
It's good to see you. Well, welcome to Next Frontier.
Fun.
We just spent quite a bit of time figuring out the technicalities. A podcast is even harder to do technically than a video conference call, huh?
Oh, good Lord. I know. We thought that COVID-19 taught us something about tech, and it just shows that we literally still know nothing. How long did it take
It's
us?
incredible.
Like 20 minutes to figure out
I think so.
microphones?
And I'm having daily issues with video conferences, right? People on Teams, on Zoom, on Google.
My favorite
It's
quote
incredible.
is still, "You're muted. You're muted." It still happens. It's very funny.
Exactly. But how are you doing, Mel? How was your day, man?
Yeah, I'm doing good. Doing very good. Very busy. I feel like 2024 has been off to like a running start. And
Okay.
yeah,
Good busy or bad busy?
good busy. Yeah, really nice. I mean, I'm still managing to get the balance right, doing some daily
Aren't we
meditation and
all?
some breathing and doing lots of dancing, but then also have
Ooh.
a few interesting projects on the back burner, and started up a founders club with
Okay.
some classmates and some friends of mine, and working on a climate environmental AI dystopian film as well,
Wow.
which is something that I'm starting up. Just got confirmation on that today. So yeah,
Okay,
lots of
so
fun stuff.
dystopian because of AI and its impact on climate, or tell me a little bit, what's that?
I can't reveal too much because it's an NDA.
Okay.
But the concept is essentially about the breakdown of society, both in a planetary way, coupled together with the crisis of AI and technology going into this
Ah.
undemocratic space. And I think it's quite telling of the times right now, because of going into 2024, we're going to have 44 democratic elections happening this year,
Mm-hmm.
including like the EU Parliament and that side. And then we also have the hottest year on record, even at the beginning of the year.
Mm-hmm.
And we're only in February, and it's already way above what it was last year in terms of global temperatures. So
Is it? I didn't
both,
know that. I just knew that last year was a very hot year, but it's
yeah.
continuing in 2024.
I mean, if the latest data and statistics from NOAA, I believe, don't quote me on
Mm-hmm.
that. It might be someone else, but I saw it on a academic paper from some credible sources. It's already almost like 20% up from last year.
Wow.
So we're already, we're like consistently going to be hitting the over 1.5%. So sorry, I'm not
Crazy.
very like lightening your spirits here, am I?
This
But
happens every time we talk, Melody, right? You go straight in. So I think the dystopian
yeah.
theme is probably pretty good for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. So the idea behind dystopian themes and films and books and series is to create a future scenario of what could be, and it raises awareness of people to understand how it is that can be avoided. And so it's a cautionary tale. It's the doppelganger tale. Actually, I've been reading Naomi Klein's Doppelganger, in which she speaks specifically about these types of things and the polarization of the world and how it is if we do create alternative dystopian narratives and conversations, then people can wake up and act on it. We see.
I think that's very
I
true.
don't
I
know.
think storytelling is a powerful tool, right? It's difficult for people to imagine a completely different world. And it's interesting what you're saying, because I think I've seen dystopian films on climate, and I think I've seen dystopian films on AI. I don't think I've seen anybody coupling the two together. So that's interesting.
And do you feel like those two dystopian films is what has led you to start sustainably?
That's a great question. I think probably not. Maybe it has tangled with my, subconscious thoughts. But there's just so many things out there that will affect you in a way of getting into the sustainability track, right? Whether it's films, whether it's journalism, facts. So it might have. Who knows? The Day After Tomorrow, when that came out a decade ago, I still remember that film.
Do you know what, Thomas? I hate to break it to you. It was more than 10 years ago.
Oh, no.
It's like, fuck. Was it that long? Yeah, I know. Day After Tomorrow was also the thing that shook me up.
I think I had it on DVD, so that says a little bit about the time.
Yeah. You know what? I think it was like 16 years ago. I would say it's about 16 to 17 years ago, that film. Which is mad.
Incredible. Fantastic. But you know what, Melanie, I'm so excited to talk to you today, because you've been working in sustainability for maybe just as long, or at least a long time.
Probably just as long.
Yeah, maybe due to that, who knows? But in a lot of different contexts, right? So there's a lot of different things that I want to talk to you about. And one of those in particular is climate justice in the supply chain. We talked a little bit about that before, and you've been doing some work there, also in the humanitarian sector, etc. So I really want to hear more about that. You also are working a bit now with AI, which is quite interesting. So that could also be something that we dive into. But before we do all of that, I think one of the very interesting things about your journey, Melanie, is a lot of the people I talked to, they sort of stumbled into sustainability. So they did something else, and then for whatever reason, they kind of suddenly found themselves leading sustainability in the company. But you've pretty much been doing it since the get-go, right? What got you into sustainability and social impact? What's the journey there?
Michael Jackson.
Michael Jackson.
You know what? I've had these moments of like deep reflection as to what are the things that have like led me down this path. And you're completely right. I mean, I became vegetarian at the age of 9, and then I started up my first hand-drawn animal rights magazine, teaching people about insects and animals when I was about, I think I did that when I was 7. And I was drawing. Do you remember those days when you got subscriptions to magazines? And so you would get like every single week, you started up, and then you got this like book binder. And then every week you got like a file of facts in which you got like new information. So you kind of built up your own encyclopedia of knowledge. So I signed up to those about nature and animals. And my obsession with nature and animals kind of grew from there. And I say Michael Jackson because at the age of 3, my parents gave me his best of greatest hits album and video. And the songs that I played on repeat, because remember, those are the days that you just listen to the music that you have on CD. This is what,
there was
like
something
30 years ago?
Interesting about that, right? That you didn't replace it all the time.
And I just listened again and again and again and again to the album. And my favorite songs were Man in the Mirror, Heal the World, Black and White. And those 3 songs, I think, essentially summarize a lot of my character. This idea behind personal development and being the change that you want to see starts with yourself. That question of like integrity. At the age of
Mm-hmm.
9, my best friend at the time told me the word hypocrisy. And she was like,
Mm-hmm.
if you say you love animals and you eat them, you're a hypocrite. And I had no idea what that word meant, but I was like, I'm not going to be a hypocrite, okay? And when I figured out what it meant, when we had the dictionary at home, that being a hypocrite is someone who says something and acts in a different way. I
Mm-hmm.
made that choice at the age of 9 that I was never going to be that. And I think that pretty much tries to be an ideal that I live up to, and is the thing that has driven my professional and personal path. But when it comes to sustainability, like, there is no difference between my professional and personal. Like, it's just it's just me.
But that's amazing that you also get to do what you're extremely passionate about. And it's funny you mentioned Michael Jackson, because I think, in the current day and age, with everything that came out about him, it's rarely that we hear the positive spin on some of those things. So that's actually an interesting point.
I mean, it's controversial in the sense of, yeah, who he is as a person and what he's done. And
Hmm.
that's abhorrent and never to be celebrated. And I think that was like a big identity crisis when that came out, and I was like, oh my God. But I think the messaging has to be separate from the person, and the messaging
Hmm.
being, it doesn't matter if you're black or white, equality and justice. And how can we talk about building a better world if we don't start with ourselves and look in the mirror first and heal the world and make it a better place? Because it's not just for me, it's for you as well. Um, and the simplicity of those messages, especially to a child, and how that can shape that there are people who have done bad things, but who say things that is meant to do good. And I hope that that's the focus that I look at. I mean, I don't listen to Michael Jackson's music anymore, but the message of those things is still there. Yeah, and I
There's
mean,
an
I
analog
was
to sustainability here in the complexity of an evaluation, right? It's very easy to simplify into a binary. He was bad, he was good. That company is doing good, that company is doing bad. But in reality, we're talking about many different separate things. And it is almost more likely that you're balancing on both the good and the bad side on different topics than you are binary doing good across all of, let's say, sustainability.
Yeah, I mean, I love that bridge and how you can draw these parallels. We live in a nuanced world, and one that is continuously trying to do better, and sometimes just completely forgets that agenda and ends up following metrics that perhaps are fulfilling the need of one group but not of the other. And if we talk about the work that I've been doing, so very very briefly, starting off within like community energy work and energy
Hmm.
poverty, working in the UK with Friends of the Earth and Save the Children, as like a youth ambassador. And then all the way through when I was an investigative journalist working in Brazil and looking at sustainable development models there, to more recently my work at the Red Cross, working in emergencies and environment, and then also working within innovation and humanitarian aid. You can kind of see that the world has a conflict of values in terms of, you're legally obliged to make money for your shareholder, if you're a limited company and you're registered. But then at the same
Hmm.
time, you have a legal obligation to people on the ground to ensure that you don't overexploit. But then in that process, there are no legal obligations to actually internalize the negative externalities on the environment. So things like pollution from mining or um, over extraction of resources, water contamination, and things like this, they aren't included within those frameworks. So I think in many
Hmm.
ways, what we see is both a conflict of values where you want to maximize money, but then also how do you protect people in that process? But then there's also a serious oversimplification when it comes to supply chains and also the world in which we've created that doesn't entirely take into account the complexity of like what we're dealing with. Um, because the simple equation is take stuff, make it into something, sell it, and make money. And
Hmm.
that linear model, I don't think is particularly helpful, both from an environmental and social perspective.
100%. And there's an oversimplification to the economic environment, talking about, okay, as long as I don't do anything bad within my own operation and sites, then I'm okay. But reality is, today's environment, your business is built on a foundation of a lot of small, medium, large businesses throughout your supply chain. And you are creating that work, you're creating that demand, but you don't have the visibility of what's happening. And you might actually, because you have a cost focus, be interrupting, I guess, climate justice in those local
You know,
environments, right?
yeah, I mean, and sometimes you don't want to see. I think that's the cold, harsh truth of the matter. So
Mm-hmm.
when I was 21, or maybe I was a bit older, maybe I was like 23, I went to Brazil and worked with
Mm-hmm.
Sindicato de Jornalistas do Amazonas, which is
Oi.
the syndicate of journalists of the trade union of the Amazon, of the Amazonas state, which is in the capital is Manaus, which is this super interesting. We want to talk about dystopian. I mean, like, man, that city is like Hunger Games. You know how
Oh yeah.
not exactly. So you know how Hunger Games is separated into zones,
Mm-hmm.
and so you have like the blue zone or like the 2 zone. So Manaus, it was the time when I was there. So that's what 2012, 2011. My God, that's so long ago. Had 9 zones. And it was also set up during the military junta, the Manaus region, as something called the Zona Franca, or Suframa, which was one of the government agencies that was set up at the time. And what they wanted to do, because it's a very strategic area, where Manaus is placed is the Rio Negro, the Black River, and the Rio Amazonas. This is where they meet. So it's the meeting of the 2 rivers. And it's
Mm-hmm.
also the kind of gateway where many countries like Ecuador and Colombia and Bolivia, and like a bit further down, they kind of all join up in this kind of hotspot. And then the river goes out, the Amazon River goes out into the Atlantic Ocean. And so it's this very, very interesting place. And it takes 2 days to go from Manaus to any other city. And they decided to create something called the Sustainable Development Model. And the idea behind this model is, because it still exists, I believe, to decouple deforestation from economic growth. And they made a free trade zone for kind of electrical equipment. So you've got the big guns out there, T-Mobile, Ericsson, Samsung, a whole list of these. And the idea behind the creation of this free trade zone is also to maintain people living in this strategic point and position. And let's not get into the fact that this area is also a hotspot for drug dealing. And, you know, they have submarines. I remember being on the beach and like waves would be coming up from the river. And I was friends, obviously, with journalists and with police officers. And, you know, and everyone is kind of like interconnected and everyone always knows what's going on. And the police and the government and media are, you know, it's Brazil. And there were waves, like huge waves coming up. And I was like, what is that? What's going on here? And they're like, oh, it's the submarines. It's the submarines with all of the drugs coming from Ecuador, Colombia, Bolivia.
No
And they kind of
way.
pass through. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I mean, it's like
Wow.
the worst known secret. Everyone knows this, but no one tackles it because of the powers that be and where that supply chain of illegal narcotics and that whole black economy that will never come into sustainability ever. Like they're not going to have sustainability targets and they're not going to like do reporting with CSRD. That's a whole other thing, right? And so when we talk about the beginning of the supply chain, both the legal and the illegal, what's going on the ground? What happens to the people? Who gets exploited? Who actually like feels the pain from lack of compliance on all sides, lack of legality, the exploitation. And the reason that this free trade zone was made to keep people there, and it was also meant to be this idea of sustainable development, that you could decouple deforestation and economic growth. And so by creating this free trade zone, what they were doing is that they were showing, and this is what I was talking about, the oversimplification of metrics, is that they made it illegal for anyone to cut down the rainforest for economic gain, or at least it was
Okay.
severely reduced. But corruption happened and the government officials had friends that could cut down the rainforest. But by and large, it was people who they couldn't cut down the rainforest anymore. So what happened with that? Number one, you have a huge number of people from the outskirts and the rural parts, even more rural than Manaus, migrating into the city, so huge urbanization. But then at the same time, you also don't have a government that wants to build new houses, so a huge increase in like disease, poverty, lack of jobs. And then if you don't want to grow your economy through deforestation, what they did was manufacturing and electronic manufacturing. But the only metric that they were measuring was deforestation in terms of environment. I had access to UNESCO protected zones with biologists, and I actually pretended to be a biologist. I was working as an investigative journalist at that time, and I was so young that I was like, whatever, I'll pretend to be a biologist. And what we found in these areas, and I have photos and videos of this, and then I wrote a thesis on this, was that a lot of these companies were dumping huge amounts of waste into the Amazon rainforest. I mean, huge amounts of waste. I saw alligators inside fridges. Like, they made fridges their home. And a lot of pollution and chemical waste just pouring into these UNESCO sites. So on paper, Suframa had the metrics to show that it had, in fact, decoupled deforestation with economic development. But then you also have an environmental catastrophe, both from the loss of biodiversity and the waste and pollution that was being made. And I think at that moment, that's really when this idea sparked, because I had been working in journalism and international relations and political science. And that's when I was like, oh my God, I need to do the environmental science part of this. I need to find a way of how do we build integrity into these sustainable development economic models that we're trying to build. And then also the climate justice part of this. Because not only did we have this issue, the CEOs and the owners, and this, I actually had to leave Brazil because I was warned that I was going to get, targeted, like actually targeted by the government, because journalists had found this and they, a couple of people had died before. Remember, although today Palestine is the most dangerous place in the world to be a journalist, before then it was Latin America, it was Brazil. And it's still very high up there. There's hundreds of journalists that die in that particular part of the world every year, every week,
Really?
because they're trying to
I
highlight
wouldn't have guessed
what
that.
happened.
I would have thought different parts of the world, maybe, places where they really suppress journalism like China, Russia. I don't know. I wouldn't have expected Latin America, actually.
Yep. Do your Googling.
Of
And you will
course.
see that the metrics, and it increases year on year. And one of the things that I found when I was there was that the CEOs, and this again, remember, this was 15 years ago or 10 years ago. So things have changed now, but what I'm telling you is the reality of what happened at that time, is that those CEOs were also very much connected to media. So they controlled media. They controlled what, like, the journalists were able to report, what they were able to report. They controlled police. They controlled politicians and politics. Like, they really did. And each of these CEOs and companies, I was told, was also in charge of particular zones. So they were able to go, zone 1 is mine, zone 2 is yours, zone 3 belongs here. And they tried to keep these different zones separate in many ways. So the people were unable to organize themselves to, remember I said that a lot of people had migrated into Manaus because they weren't allowed to cut down the rainforest, which is what they were doing for their subsistence farming and, small craft work or small scale kind of companies. They had no income anymore. They had no education. They had no prospect. They had no access to infrastructure like water. And also climate change in itself was driving and is driving a lot of change and drought in these areas and disease. And so they moved into the cities. And then these CEOs were controlling these different areas, don't want people to revolt, don't want people to stand up, want to control what information gets out there. And then there was also a rumor, which I do not know to be entirely true, that there was also child sex trafficking. And that within these different zones, in order to take payment and to keep this type of kind of underground mafia or what was happening, is that there were a lot of children that were given as payment to some of these leaders within these companies. And this is extremely dangerous information to have. And I was overwhelmed with this understanding of what was going on, and I wanted to investigate further, and I wanted to know what more was going on. Because at the same time, these journalists were also getting tip-offs and information from the police, from the politicians, to find and follow stories about finding narcos, finding child traffickers. And we would get very, very small scale stories to follow up. They would arrest like super poor people that had a bag of cocaine in their suitcase, whilst they
Mhm.
knew that there were submarines, huge submarines with like tons of cocaine passing through. And so you have this interesting dystopic like part of the world where you don't actually go to the root of the problem and try and solve it, because the people who are at the root of the problem are also those in power. But they have to show that they're doing something to keep people in some type of like belief that something is being done. And so you go for like the small scale criminals, you go for the small scale stories, and then you sensationalize that within newspapers. They actually have a particular section called like the policing section. And that's where all
Mhm.
of these like stories and things would come up. And in Brazil, there's a real obsession with these types of TV programs. And so it's just this very, very interesting. And this is what I mean by Hunger Games, that instead of focusing on like the capital and where it is that you need to really create change, there's this distraction and this creation of, yeah. Anyway, I'll stop now.
No, there's so many things in what you just said, Melanie, that I want to pick apart. First of all, I'm just surprised that there's no submarines on Netflix on Narcos, right? Because that just seems like prime television. But maybe we'll get a season soon with submarines. I would definitely watch that.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, there's a few different things that I want to pick apart. The first, very obvious one, which I just keep finding fascinating. So I talked with the Fairtrade CEO not too long ago, and he told me how when you engage with smallhold farmers and you start pushing them for decarbonization and investing in reducing their emissions, you will risk increasing the probability that social stuff will be happening, like child labor, forced labor, and these kind of things, because these suppliers are already operating on such thin margins that if they are forced to invest in something new, it comes at the cost of something else. And that's when it really started clicking for me that sustainability is not just one thing, right? And we should actually be really careful about using the word sustainability because we refer to so many different things at the same time. And one of them might have counter consequences on the other one. Like what you said here, we're optimizing for deforestation. We're creating a lot of social issues in the process of that. We're transferring to a new industry with waste management issues. That's fascinating, right? Have you seen any other examples of that?
I mean, I guess, yeah, first of all, I agree. Like this is glaringly obvious, I think, only to people who are within the field. To anyone else,
Hmm.
it's very hard to understand. And that's why it's a problem, because those who are buying within a supply chain want to have a fair price for themselves. Often it's not even a fair price, because if you think back to pre-industrialization times, the amount that we would spend, let's take food, for example, a commodity that none
Hmm.
of us can live without. We would spend over 50% of our salaries on food. And the industrialization process was optimized in order to really reduce that so that you can really spend less than 10% of your disposable income on food. And the idea behind that is to feed the masses, to then be able to go out and work. And so you could create and produce more and not have to have such a high cost for input. That world is quite different to the world that we require today. And also the industrial revolution, now we have the technological and AI revolution. But what's happened in that process is that we've really fragmented our world, and we've made it so that the person that produces and the person that consumes, there isn't like 2 or 3 gaps in between that. You don't have a conversation with your farmer that goes, "Hey, like these new environmental organic things that I need to, I can't use the old fertilizer. It's like, it's killing me. I can't really afford it, and like this milk, like it really should cost this much, and what we're doing in order to squeeze the bottom line is, unfortunately, the cows have to reduce their space, and unfortunately, we have to treat them with And that can be replaced with anything. That can be replaced with child labor, that can be replaced with the forced women labor. And so because we don't have that capacity to even have a conversation with either the end consumer or the middle consumer or the businesses in between, that's one, like the lack of dialogue, I think is significantly part of that. And when you don't have the dialogue, you don't have awareness. And then on top of that, you also have people who don't recognize what something should really cost and what it really means when you're asking for better sustainability, for reduced carbonization. And yeah, of course, I've seen that. This is starkly obvious when we talk about the biggest input that we have, which is fuel. When you have a demand for warm homes all the time, or when you have a demand for transportation whenever you want it, like the EV car revolution that's happened in Europe. We want electronic cars, and we want them now. We want them yesterday. We want an integrated electronic vehicle network in Europe where you can charge at your convenience wherever. But we don't understand that that has a consequence, that we live in an interconnected world, that the wants and needs of one group directly impact exponentially in a negative way another group. And
Hmm.
there's coal mines in Congo right now that are fueled by child labor, and they're working around the clock because of the demand for lithium. I think I watched a documentary in which there's a demand for lithium that is, we need 60 times more than what we currently have in order to meet that demand. And
Hmm.
that demand is not lessening. People are not being told, want your electric car in 10 years' time, and we're able to deliver on it. No, the way in which things are done is I want it and I want it now. I want Tesla to produce this car and I want to use it next week. I don't want to wait for it. Why should I wait for it? It's because we don't have that dialogue and that connection of like, us not waiting for it means that there's a child who has to go down a cobalt mine for 15 hours a day. Us not waiting for it means that there's shortcuts being taken by mining companies in Sierra de Pascua in Peru that wants to get copper, and that ends up in the pollution of water for an entire community that then see, which is something that I've worked on together with Source International through Forum Sieve, where you see an increase in cancer rates by 80%. When you see an increase in death rates among and also deformation of unborn fetuses. We don't talk about these things.
Mm.
And it's for many reasons, because it's complex, because we don't have access to that information, because we don't want to see, because we're cultured into not seeing, many, many reasons.
It's very complex. I wonder, there's definitely a lot to be said about consumer demand, especially in the West, about that being unsustainable. So I don't even want to challenge that. One thing I do want to challenge maybe is when we talk about some of these technologies that are enablers for the climate transition. Maybe not, let's not even talk EV specifically, just because the climate calculation there is complex, right?
Depends how your
But if we
LCA is
say,
done, yeah.
exactly, but if we want to transfer to renewable energy sources, solar panels, windmills, etc., they require batteries. That requires conflict minerals, these kind
Lithium.
of things. Exactly. We need a speed to that transition, not just because of consumer demand, but also because we need to transition away from these energy sources running on fossil fuels. So, is speed really the issue here, or is it governance of the supply chain and delivering on that speed in sustainable ways?
Like you're asking a climate activist. I think it depends what hat you want to put on, right? And we talk about climate justice, and we also have to talk about just transition. And that's a just transition in a north and south divide. What we see around us in Europe and the developed world, where yes, we have access to continuous energy whenever we want it, we have access to clean water, to hot water, although simply put, it's like this. We also have exponentially growing levels of inequality. And when we
Hmm.
talk about the AI revolution or the technological and digitalization revolution, the fact that automation is also making many jobs irrelevant. It's not just going to make jobs irrelevant now, which is like the labor force, the working class is also coming for the middle classes. But let's just focus on what's happened today and right now. You also see that there is a growing discontent in a huge group of people who both feel left behind by the liberal democracy agenda. They feel left behind. Why are people voting for Trump and Brexit? Why are people voting behind populist governments? Well, there's many different reasons, but one of them that I would say is really driving that is this feeling of like irrelevance, right? Is this feeling that this lie that we've been told that we can endlessly grow and everyone can see prosperity is not necessarily the truth of what we see anymore. And so you also couple that with this idea of how do we transition into something that is truly sustainable, both environmentally, socially, economically? The only answer that I can possibly give you is that what we're looking at with the transition into EV or renewable energies at the speed that we're going at is that we still believe that we can continue to grow. And that ideology is morally, economically, and environmentally corrupt. Like there is no more that we can grow at the speed that we're growing at without completely annihilating both our resources, destroying our oceans, destroying the quality of water, the soils, it's unbelievable. Like we're running out of potassium even to be able to do fertilization of large scale agriculture. And we haven't found a way to synthetically make that. And we're also facing huge crises when it comes to healthcare, the spread of diseases, the complete breakdown of our biodiversity that we've lost. It's the 6th mass extinction. We've depleted more than 70% of biodiversity. And with that means that we reduce the barrier that's between humans and animals. COVID-19, it came because of this closeness of living between over-domesticated animals, of which cows outnumber humans by like a factor of 100 on this planet. And the over-domestication, the push down of cost and standards and quality because of that increasing demand, and even wanting to change into something like renewable energy or changing into synthetic made meat or changing, that still has at the heart of it this ideology, which I believe is completely corrupt, of endless growth. That's part of the green economy. And I think the only solution for me, in an ideological way, and it's not perfect, is something like degrowth. How do we genuinely decouple our economy from well-being? And how do we create something that, I don't know, maybe yes, maybe no, maybe I don't even believe what I'm saying next week when I see new metrics and new options, but it does worry me, this idea that we can technologically fix ourselves and grow ourselves out of this crisis. And Albert Einstein put it perfectly when he said, if you try to fix a problem in the same way again and again and again and you fail, it's a sign of madness. If you keep trying to do the same thing in the same way, you're going to continue failing, and it's a complete sign of madness. I didn't quote that entirely correct, but the essence of it
I think you were close enough to the original quote. But I think Melanie, so I agree with parts of that argument, and I disagree with others. I think by definition, the status quo is not working. We are running on energy sources that are not working from a climate perspective. If we want to make change, if we want to transition into something different, then that will always mean degrowth of one category and growth of another category. Degrowth of the oil industry and growth of the renewable energy industry. So no growth is simply just reducing consumption at the status quo, but the status quo isn't working. So if you want to make a transition, don't you need to grow some technologies, some industries that doesn't exist today?
That's a very good point. And I think maybe for clarity's sake, what I mean by degrowth is that if we're going to be, it doesn't mean like not growing anything. And it doesn't mean like we stop and we do nothing and we go back to caveman ages. What it means instead is where is the excess? When we look at food, for example, we produce 33% of what we produce is thrown away, roundabout, the latest statistics. We produce enough food today to feed the world 3 times over, almost, for everyone to have just about enough, for everyone to have the recommended daily intake. So when we talk about growth or degrowth in that sense, do we still need to continue growing the agricultural sector if we're already producing 3 times over what people need? And so the question comes about growth, that it's it needs to have this continuous growth trajectory, like a GDP, something that has a metric, something that has a production, because inherently it's part of a financial system that continues to recognize growth and incremental growth year on year on year, not dependent on how much excess you produce, not dependent, and then if you produce excess, that's not seen as a negative. This is why we have, in the 80s, 90s, and I think maybe 5 years ago, we had the milk piles in Europe, because there's such heavy subsidy on dairy products that they didn't have, they were producing too much. There's the economy of scale. I mean, all of this is the economies and the metrics and the laws of physics that run our current way of thinking, that we don't take into account negative environmental externalities. We don't include pollution. We don't include deforestation with any of those metrics. A hamburger should cost $300 or something if you take into account all of the costs of it. And so when I say degrowth or not growing, it's not within the way that you have just presented it. Yeah, but we have to grow the renewable energy sector. We can't not grow it. Of course we do. But it needs to be grown or made in the way, and the transition needs to be made in a way that is also responding to what is adequate for the environmental, for the energy demand. Well, how much do we need? How much is excess? How do we ensure that we have balance in the system? I think one of my, I have many favorite kind of speakers, but one particular book and speaker that really touched me is a doctor called Dr. Geoffrey West. And he is a physician and a physicist and a biologist and an ecologist. And he wrote a book called Scale, in which he compares natural systems to human-made infrastructure systems like cities, and then also businesses. And he tries to make a comparison and to understand what true sustainability would look like if we, within our social systems and infrastructure and businesses, could emulate nature. So nature has an efficiency that every time it doubles, it improves its efficiency by 33%. And we all know that there is a complete circular economy within the environment because there is no waste. The waste that is produced by animals decomposes down into the ground, and then it's reused to grow by trees, and the trees are the food. And so it goes, and so goes, and so goes. There is no waste. The amount of calories that are required for a mouse, if it's scaled up to the size of an elephant would need to eat a football pitch, 10 football pitches every day. But it doesn't need that because it actually improves its efficiency by 33% every time it doubles. What if our economies and the way in which, oh, and by the way, spoiler, we're not that efficient. So every time we double, we are nowhere near that level of efficiency. We become more inefficient the more we grow. So the more we grow, the more inefficient we become, the more we require, the more waste we produce. But the more we grow. And so that metric is measuring the wrong thing. What if we could have a different way of organizing our businesses, a different way of organizing and understanding what growth really means? I think that's what degrowth is really. I mean, I'm not an expert in that, but that's really what it's talking about. It's how do we bring in these things that we ignore in these metrics, and how do we grow in a way that is also responding to the needs and also taking into considerations other constraints.
I like that. I think that's interesting, Melanie. And I think, I read a ridiculous story the other day about the wine industry in France and how that's being subsidized so much that you now have, and during COVID, a lot of French people apparently they started up wineries because why not? It's COVID. So now you have an excess of supply because it's being subsidized. There's so much on the market that's bringing prices down. So what do? You start pouring wine out in the sink, right? In the sewers. And that's just that was just for me just an obscene example of this, the problems with the economic system in these kind of things, where you start just pouring it down the drain to make the supply and demand curve more favorable, right?
I mean, it's mad and
But I
dumb,
think
right?
it completely, like, it's Soviet Union, you're digging a hole to fill it again just to create labor, right? There's no value created, nothing.
Yeah.
um, but what I also think is really interesting is this whole conversation around waste and circularity and efficiency. And I think to some extent, I think our two perspectives can be bridged with that. We've talked before, Melanie. I'm a little bit of a techno optimist. You are probably more of a realist, which makes for some really interesting discussions. And in my opinion, growth can also come from being more efficient, managing your waste better, growing your profits in that way by finding revenue streams for your waste and these kind of things, regulating waste and durability and all of those things that's related to circularity. I think those parts are inherently not working today, and we need solutions for them. So I think
Hmm?
that's a very good point in the whole problem we have today. I want to ask you
Look,
one more question, Melanie. Sorry, just because I know we're running out of time. But you talked about journalism, and you've been very active in that area, right? And I know one of the main ways that a lot of companies today are looking at their supply chains and getting information about suppliers would be through journalism, monitoring adverse news and media data. If a supplier was mentioned in a problem or something like that, does that even make sense from your point of view with what you've been involved with in Latin America?
yeah. Okay. So there's a couple of things, and I'm going to try. I know I talk a lot. I'm going to try and reduce what I'm saying, but I'm
But
thinking
it's
as I'm
interesting.
talking, so
Don't
it
worry
makes it
about it.
difficult. I've taken some notes. Look, I think going back to the point that you made before about excess being thrown away, there is something extremely wrong about our current economic system, and that is undeniable. That's said at Davos, that's said by like every major economist in the world. Like everyone knows. We're just not doing anything about it right now. Huge luxury brands, of which I will not name, had a massive scandal when someone found out that last year they burnt $40 million worth of apparel. And that was because they didn't want to devalue their product by flooding it. So there's a question about the supply and demand, but then there's also about the question about the value of a product. And it's fascinating and completely bonkers that we have a world in which you protect the value of your product by burning it rather than allowing it to go out. It's that scarcity idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
I personally think that businesses, whether they don't like it right now, I think in the long run, will love to have new restrictions put in that don't allow them to do that,
Mm-hmm.
right? That there's a different way in which, and I'm not an economist, so I can give you the answer to this, but a way in which items are valued differently. Maybe we want to go down the B Corp path, in which your value that you create is social value and it's environmental value, return on environment, not return on investment. And in that way, why would you ever burn a product? Maybe there's another way in which it retains its value, but it's reused in another way. We need to create different narratives and different futures, not continuing to peddle the same narrative in which we all know is broken and led us somewhere that doesn't lead us to any good. Now,
But I
I'm
think
not a
maybe
tech.
just to pick up on that, Melanie, because I think scarcity is human, right? We will always desire things that are scarce because that makes us special. I don't think that's ever going to go away. But what if you say you're not allowed to destroy goods like that? You need to find a way to upcycle them, recycle them, whatever,
Or
so
just
it doesn't
produce
get
less.
thrown out. Or produce less,
Or
100%.
produce less and have a way of, I mean, like I was working with a luxury brand just quite recently. Like we were using it as part of our AI business consulting, which is what I'm looking at now, how to use AI within sustainability and also for business consulting. And this also touches upon your question that you had about journalism and content creation and also, you can do different, really cool different things with sentiment analysis, and you can also use AI to be able to understand, and blockchain and things like this, to understand the integrity of the data that you collect, as well as being able to find and predict hotspots and see like, oh, okay, this type of area, according to, different corruption indexes or transparency indexes or human rights and labor law indices and these types of couple that with like social media sentiment analysis. Oh, that might be a hotspot factory that we H&M need to we need to go there and we need to help them out and make sure that they still comply with the labor laws. You can use technology for that, and I really see that we're going to be using it more and more and more, and both to be able to, everyone has a phone. Are you able to somehow connect verified data and information from someone's phone to report human rights abuses, to report environmental degradation abuses? Can we create a global community of accountability and traceability of certain items? Yeah, I mean, there's some really cool things that are happening. I won't tell you which company it is, but there's a company that's working on putting a RFID tagging into clothing, so that you're able to be able to trace back who had this jumper before me. This is a secondhand jumper. Who had it before me? What was their story? And in that way, what I was saying before about the connection between like the maker of something and the end consumer, and there can be many sort of end consumers if you make a product that is meant to be used endlessly or is made with the highest quality so that it gets passed on. How can we build the fabric of what we wear also into building a fabric of community? I think those are like the fun and exciting questions about business. Not how can we get more money, not how can we do things faster, not, oh, how do we comply with the new CSRD and how do we comply with supply chain reporting? But really, how can we be a business that is also reflecting our values, the values of the people around us, and also ensuring that we don't totally fuck up the planet in the process? I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on this podcast, but how do we do it?
You can do whatever you want.
To not, and I think these questions for me are so exciting. And whilst I might be a realist or I might be a pessimist some ways, I also believe in the ingenuity of humanity. I just think that the issue that we have is that we can't break free of the story that we have been told for the past 50, 60 years. And until we go, this doesn't work anymore, and we shout out the emperor's clothes and we go, stop. No, we're going to do this now. And as long as we have the guts of decision makers and government officials who are able to change the laws, they're able to go, no, you can't have endless profiteering energy companies when oil prices are high and you want to squeeze everyone for the money that they have and you have record-breaking profits, which is exactly what happened last year. When we go, no, that's not allowed. I'm not saying that we should have anything close to a communist regime, but something that we don't have unfettered, unregulated profiteering that comes at the cost of like environment and people. Until we're able to bring that in, and I think we will be able to within my lifetime. I don't think we'll have true sustainability, but the process of being able to get there requires people like you, me, business leaders, economists, academics, conservationists, ecologists, biologists, all of us to come together in this ability to actually converse and come up with what is the best way forward, and for us to globally create a new narrative.
Amazing. That's super fascinating, Melanie. It's very ideological as well. So if we try to bring it maybe down to a more pragmatic level, if there's one word you want to leave a sustainability manager with who's getting started on supply chain sustainability without them changing the political structures in which they operate in, what would that be?
Do a systems analysis and find the point, the leverage point. Find your point of the path of least resistance that you are both able to create change on. Each of us should be able to identify, where am I in the system and what capacity do I have to change and what can I change and how can I change it and what's the fastest way to change it. I'm going to give you a very short story. So I was working with the Red Cross last year and we were doing an emergency response to the Turkish earthquake. And we managed to be able, and you won't know how tough this is, but it's really damn tough, to send out an environmental emergency responder to go out at the same time as you're setting out the food, the tents, the emergency healthcare response, to send out an environmental emergency responder to be able to look at all of this going on and say, where can we increase environmental sustainability and how can we reduce the damage on the environment? Humanitarian response, it caused one of the biggest cholera outbreaks in Haiti during the 2018 earthquake, because water was released that was into waterways that was not treated. So humanitarian big operations, if they don't adhere to environmental standards, they can cause a lot of damage. And so what we did in the earthquake last year in Turkey was to look at that system, look at that leverage point and go, where can we affect the most change, the most positive impact with the simplest change? And how can we also have the social aspect, the environmental aspect, the economic aspect? And what we did together with the Turkish Red Crescent, or Kızılay, is to go, okay, well, they're feeding 1 million people a day with hot food, and right now they're producing 17 tons of waste a day. And we did those calculations of polystyrene, because everything was done in reusable polystyrene. And so what we found was a local supplier that was able to actually create reusable cutlery and reusable, so that you could eat the food every day. And not only would that be paid back within 3 days, so we would save money on the polystyrene, it was also, like, the LCA of it was also significantly less than the polystyrene. You can see the data that we came up with as well. And then also on top of that, we managed to find a local supplier in a country that's been devastated by, like, the worst earthquake in that area, like, ever to hit it in, like, 150 years. I mean, these are the types of solutions that I want sustainability managers to think about and go, where can I affect change? What does the system say? Where is the most waste? Where is the biggest opportunity? And how is that in relation to what I can do? And to believe in your own agency. You're not there just to write reports and say, we achieved this and this and this. You're there to make change. And I think we each need to realize, like, we are the man in the mirror. You can be an agent of change. You just have to believe that you can find that point and just freaking go for it.
I love that example. And I love when we bring forward examples where sustainability isn't necessarily at the conflict of cost. The fact is, waste and inefficiency is expensive. And they're also big causadors of unsustainable production. Sometimes there are opportunities like the one you mentioned to balance the two of those. And I think we way too rarely pay enough attention to that.
I mean, the thing is also, knowledge exchange. But that was hard to say. Knowledge exchange. We wanted to, as like a second stage to that response. And just to say, Kızılay, the Turkish Red Crescent, did an incredible job in that response. They were really phenomenal and incredible at their response. And it's very rare that you are able to have such a level of logistic capacity when it comes to such a big emergency. So that's kind of a side note. But something that we tried doing as a second stage to the recovery was to recall the tents. So there was 800,000 tents that were sent out, and those are produced in Turkey. And normally that just gets thrown away. In basically every single response, in a shelter response, so in a tent response, most of those just get thrown away and burned, or they just get dumped, or they just get left. And so what we wanted to try and do, I mean, 800,000, that's a lot. What we wanted to do was, how can we recall those back in, and how can we repair? How can we use the metal poles to recycle? And how can we make some kind of like local economy, of like a circular economy from humanitarian and emergency? We don't know how to do that. We're a humanitarian sector. We don't know how to do that. And so I remember trying to set up different partnerships with different organizations who are waste experts, private sector, business. And there is so much behind that someone out there knows exactly how to do. But they don't know that someone else needs to know that. And again, it comes back to the same conversation about how do we create a community? How do we create dialogue? How do we create conversation? Because we need conversation. If we talk about the issues in the world today, both polarization, the rise of populism, environmental degradation, inequality, like so many of these things, maybe it's as oversimplification, but I honestly believe can be resolved if we just have a platform to talk to each other. And if we have a joint common goal to do better than what we're doing today. And if we think that it's not just for me, it's for you as well. Maybe that's oversimplified,
what a point to stop on. I think that was great, Melanie. So let's communicate more and see where we can find solutions to these different problems. Melanie, I could keep talking to you about this subject for hours, but you've already given me so much time. So thank you so much. This was absolutely amazing.
Thank you.
So Melanie, thank you so much for coming on Next Frontier. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, I loved it. And I look forward to seeing who else you get on and hearing their stories. So thank you so much for the time, Thomas.
Thank you, Melanie. If you're still here, then first of all, thank you so much for listening. If you've got thoughts about this episode or what you'd like to hear more of, you can email us at thomas@nextfrontier.earth. We really do read every email. You can also hit me up directly on LinkedIn. Just search for Thomas Buch Andersen. That's Thomas B-U-C-H Andersen. If you feel like it, please share with your friends and subscribe wherever you listen to our podcast. We also have a YouTube channel. It's on @NextFrontierEarth if you want to see what we actually look like in person. And if you really love the show, hit us with that 5-star review. Today's episode was produced and edited by Christina Sotu, and Next Frontier music is by Keyhole. See you next time.